Welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins. It's a real pleasure to be joined today by Arielle Nissenblatt. Arielle, you're very welcome to the show. Let's begin by asking you to introduce yourself. Tell us everything that's going on in your world, because it's varied and very exciting. So over to you,
Everything?
Well, we'll see how we get on time-wise,
Okay.
but I'm sure we can cover some of the really great work you're involved in.
I am the community marketing manager at Descript, which is an awesome editing platform that allows you to use text to edit as opposed to waveform. You can also use the waveform, but the real cool thing about Descript is that you can use text to edit as if you're editing a Word document. So I've been working there for almost a year. Before that, I was at SquadCast. SquadCast was acquired by Descript. So now if you have a Descript account, you have SquadCast for free. That's a remote recording platform. Big part of my identity has been SquadCast for the past few years. So I really loved managing the community there and managing the content there. That's where I got a lot of experience on the community management side of things. I also currently run a podcast recommendation newsletter called EarBuds Podcast Collective. Been running it since 2017. The idea behind it is that it's 5 podcast episodes on a theme. Each week is curated by a different person. Anyone can curate a list. So I started that because I just love podcasts and want more people to love podcasts and discover their next favorite show. I also started it so that I can amplify creators, because podcast creators can select one of their own episodes to be featured. So really great way to get your show out there into the world. I also host a bunch of podcasts. I host a podcast recommendation podcast called Feedback with EarBuds, which is going to be rebranding in the next few months, and that'll be fun. So announcements to come on that. I also host a weekly podcast about podcast trailers called Trailer Park, the Podcast Trailer Podcast, with my co-host, Tim Villegas. I also host a daily podcast called Daily Tips that may or may not help you with Arielle and Ned. And that is a 1 to 2 minute podcast and video show every day where you may or may not learn something new. And then I'm also on the board of governors for the Podcast Academy, which is the institution that puts together the AMBIs, the Awards for Excellence in Audio, and also does a lot of mentorship programs. And it's a really great group to be a part of. And then I do other things here and there in the podcast space, a lot of, helping creators figure out what tools they need to use to be successful. And I do some consulting on marketing and growth, and sometimes ideation and monetization and distribution. Really just try to be on top of everything that's going on in audio/podcasting so that I can be the podcast person in your life.
I love it. I love it a lot, Arielle. And look, you're in the right place. Creatives, leaders, and thinkers, that's what we focus on here. And you've got so much going on in this space. And I love it. So also just little things like saying that, look, if you use Descript, you've already got SquadCast, and things like that are really, really great to know. But of course, we know the Podcast Academy, that you're a board member there. I know you were recently judging the Webby Awards, which I think at the time of recording is now public vote stage. And then, of course, we've just wrapped up Podcast Movement. So there's an awful lot going on in this space, isn't there? And I wanted to ask you about that. You've been in the podcast space for a while. You've obviously got a passion and a love for it. You do so much in the space. But do you think that big brands are getting the memo? Do you think that companies are actually benefiting from the world of podcasting? Or do you still see, as I do, and this is why I'm asking the question, a lot of brands and companies that don't even have a podcast today, a lot of individuals who don't use the power of whether it's audio podcasting or video podcasting or creating that sort of brand or channel, they don't do it. And you're somebody who's got many of these successful entities up and running. You're engaged in the industry. Where are we at? What's the pulse of the industry like today?
So it's funny because when you first started asking that question, I thought you were referring to brands advertising in the podcast space, and I had an answer all queued up, which is that some brands, the brands that get it, basically, meaning it's slow growth. If you're advertising on podcasts, you are mostly making a brand awareness play. You are over time appealing to the potentially perfect customer by guessing and checking different audiences. That takes a while. So MailChimp obviously is a brand that advertised on cereal, which was huge. So a lot of people know MailChimp and use MailChimp. It is the first email service provider that I used for my newsletter in 2017 because of cereal. And I also use Squarespace because of Savage Lovecast. I used a ton of brands because I had heard about them for years. I use Bombas, the socks. I love Bombas. I order them every single year because of The Illusionist. Like, there are certain brands that I can track to certain products, and it is because of their long-standing approval by the podcast that I love. But that's not what you asked. I hope that was an interesting
Well,
tangent.
that is an interesting segue. And before you move on from that,
Okay.
it's kind of there's kind of two, isn't there? There's sort of the ad that plays on a podcast that you love, and it kind of gets into you,
Yeah.
into the psyche. I would follow you on things like Squarespace and SurveyMonkey, and
I did also use SurveyMonkey. Yeah.
MailChimp, and all these great brands have actually used a lot of these sort of podcast ads. But also there's the host read podcast, was the point I wanted to make as well,
Right.
where you're actually getting the endorsement from the host. But you're right, it isn't the question I was asking. I did sort of take it on a bit of a wild goose chase, but the question I'm asking really is about how a brand uses it themselves,
Yeah.
rather than advertising on somebody else's podcast as a
I
vehicle.
think some brands have figured it out. The brands that have figured it out are the brands that know that it cannot be a sales play. Sort of similar to what I was saying about advertising. It can't be the MailChimp podcast, a conversation about email marketing. It has to be something interesting and different that people are just skeptical of brands at this point. I know this because every time I try to do something on Descript, like, for example, we're working on a series right now, and we are making sure that even though it's hosted by me and Ashley Hamer, who both work at Descript, and it will be Descript branded, and there will be callbacks to the Descript blog and things like that, we're also making sure not to say, this is the Descript podcast. We're saying, this is the name of the podcast, and this is the value that we are going to share. And that's because even if people trust Descript, even if people love Descript, even if people can't live without Descript, there's something about a brand that makes people inherently not trust. And it's because ultimately we're pointing back to our own things. So we're making sure to give value, but also acknowledge that people want value from people, not necessarily from brands. So I think one podcast that I can point to that is a branded podcast that was fascinating to me was called Homemade. It was branded from Rocket Mortgage, which is a mortgage company. And the thing that they did that was really great is that it wasn't like, here's how a mortgage can help you, and here's how to get one, and here are stories of people that have paid off their mortgages and about home ownership. No, they took they took one word, they boiled it down, or the one phrase, they boiled down what they do, which is home ownership. And they interpreted that in different ways, and they found stories of people who interpret the concept of owning a home in different ways. So they interviewed somebody who lived at the base of a mountain in Washington State. I'm forgetting which mountain off the top of my head. And they would not move when there was going to be a natural disaster. That was just what they decided. So it's about insurance. It's about home ownership, yes, but it's also an amazing story of survival. And I just thought it was a fascinating way to get the word homeownership and the brand Rocket Money stuck in my head. So I think the brands that do well are the brands that understand that they need to tell stories, and those stories cannot be boring. And I know that sounds easy to say and not so easy to do, but you just have to make sure that you get somebody on it who listens to the show that is not in your camp.
I love it. And yeah, I think Rocket Mortgages did quite a bit of podcast advertising themselves on quite a number of shows. And that brand is certainly one that resonates with me. I know Rocket Mortgages. And tell me then, so how does that translate into building a community? You mentioned the EarBuds Podcast Collective, these sort of 5 magic episodes according to a theme, that type of concept behind it. Where did this come from? How does that help? Is it a community play? Is it an offering value play? Is it all of the above? How's it going at the EarBuds Podcast Collective?
I started the newsletter in 2017 because I was a relatively recent, university graduate. I graduated in 2014, and I was listening to podcasts a lot and wanted to live in the podcast world. I wanted to work in the podcast world. I wanted to attend events. I wanted to meet my favorite podcasters. I wanted to potentially create podcasts, but not be the host. I wanted to have a part in the emerging world of podcasts and audio storytelling. And no one would hire me because I had no experience. My degree was in geography and I loved it. I love geography very much. I still think one day about marrying my love of audio and my love of maps and population and demographics and things like that. But I wasn't on my college radio station. I didn't take any marketing classes. I had no interest, I thought, in that world of things until I started listening to podcasts. And Serial came out in 2014 while I was at my first job out of college. My first job out of college was at a nonprofit, and mostly as a coordinator, very entry level position. And I realized that I was completely immersed in audio from Serial, and I wanted to find more podcasts to listen to. So I started finding more podcasts to listen to, started asking friends what they were listening to, and then finding out that there was this whole world of podcast listening going on. And when I would meet people who love podcasts, they'd be like, "Oh, I also love podcasts." And there was something about that that felt different from saying, "Oh, I also love books." It felt a little different, like there's something a little bit more going on there. Maybe because it's new, maybe because it's a little bit more, it's a lot more niche than loving books, than loving film, than loving TV. But I thought that there was something that I could capitalize on there. So I moved to LA shortly after Serial came out, and I was traveling a lot within the city and always stuck in traffic. And I decided while I was stuck in traffic that the only thing keeping me sane was listening to podcasts, but I was kind of running out of podcasts to listen to every week, which seems impossible because even at the time there were hundreds of thousands of them. How could I be running out? I was running out of ones that were endorsed by others, or that I, off the top of my head, by just looking at the cover art or reading the description, was immediately drawn to. And I thought to myself, I'm missing out on content. So what if I ask friends or friends of friends what they're listening to, and we can use that as an opportunity to create a network of people who love different podcasts. And these are sort of like endorsed by people within this collective. So speaking of SurveyMonkey, I put out a survey in late 2016 that was basically like, do you listen to podcasts? Do you want to be part of this collective, whatever that means? Are you interested in contributing? What are some of the podcasts that you love? And I asked a few more questions. And I used that to build my initial email list. And when I sent out the first issue of EarBuds, it was on Gmail. I accidentally CC'd everybody as opposed to BCCing everybody. And it was like the ugliest thing you could ever imagine, but it got the content across. So the first theme ever was called New Beginnings. So I curated it, and I found 5 podcast episodes on the theme of new beginnings. And I still remember a few of them. It was from This American Life and How to Be Amazing with Michael Ian Black and a few others. And it has changed a lot since. The newsletter has changed a lot since. It's now an engine where anybody can curate a list. I have a submission form, so we get submissions from all over the world. We get submissions from famous people. We get submissions from everyday folks who have just an interest in podcasts. They don't host a podcast. They are not advocating for a podcast. They just love a specific theme, and they want to challenge themselves to find 5 podcast episodes on that theme. And the goal of the newsletter is to expose people to all of the audio content that's out there. So our archive is 7+ years old. Every Sunday we've sent out the newsletter. So we have hundreds and hundreds of lists on topics of all sorts of topics. And really, like anything you can imagine, we've probably done a list on. And it's becoming a really great archive of audio content. Earbuds.audio is the website if you want to check it out. And it is one of the joys of my life. It's like a child to me. I love running this newsletter, and it's gotten me every single paid opportunity that I've gotten in the podcast space. Having this newsletter has allowed me to, it shows initiative. So when I was 24 and I was applying to jobs, it allowed me to say, I have this newsletter, and even if you don't hire me, I will continue to have this newsletter. I will do this on my own because I love it. And I've also monetized it. So I'm very proud of it. I love it.
Thank you for sharing that insight, Arielle, because it is incredible that how, that what started off, I imagine, in very small and Gmail and, CCing everybody instead of BCCing everybody to what it is today, this archive, and still a passion and something that you're very proud of. And also wonderful to hear that, a lot of the maybe opportunities and connections and community that have come from that, just from that sort of being able to pull that information together and to share that value, which is what it is, with people who are also looking for maybe a group of shows on the same sort of topic. It's, and on
Yeah,
one hand, it's so simple. On the other hand, it's really helpful and valuable to people that are into this space.
totally. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is I recently switched my email service provider from MailChimp to Beehive, and I like it. I think it's a lot easier to view. I've gotten a lot of email responses like this is so much prettier, and I'm like, hell yeah, that's my whole goal, spent a lot of money to migrate it because I wanted to make sure that it was pretty, so I hired a company to download my subscribers, upload them to the new platform, but also to build a bunch of templates for me and make sure that the automations were good to go. And I'm really proud with how it came out. The interesting thing is that I think it's easier on Beehive. They make it more obvious to unsubscribe. So I've gotten a lot of people unsubscribing, which has been very sad. However, the landing page that they create for me, which is newsletter.earbuds.audio, is also really friendly. So I get a lot of subscribers every week too. So we net positive every week, which is interesting. And when I'm feeling down about the unsubscribe number, pretty much immediately I get a response from somebody who's like, I love this newsletter so much. I think that it's super valuable. And every time I know this is just the way of the world. Some people are going to love what you do. Some people are not going to love what you do. And it's just validating to get positive feedback about it. So thank you.
Well, I no, perfect. And I think, net positive is a good place to be. And obviously we all try to mitigate the downside and mitigate the people that unsubscribe. But sometimes as well, we get carried away, don't we? I know I fall into the trap where the vanity number really, you think everybody's reading and watching all the time. And the truth is they're not. A portion of that audience is engaged at any moment in time. And it's great that you're adding new people to the community. And it brings me on to something I want to ask you, particularly with your vantage point, knowledge and experience. And that is, I've seen with great enthusiasm that a lot of TV production companies, a lot of sort of film companies are getting into the podcasting space because it's a great way that after an episode airs, there's like an online podcast community, or an episode will air. At the time of recording, Serial have just released the next sort of iteration of Serial, which is exciting, I know, for lots of people. But I'm just wondering whether you think that there is a really strong link now between, high-end produced content and the podcasting world, because originally it started off maybe more of a niche thing, maybe a bit more of a small topic, but more and more I'm seeing mainstream. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I'm seeing it a lot when it comes to film, particularly TV streaming services, where the podcast is
Limited series. Yeah.
it's becoming part of the overall content for a show.
It is becoming part of the overall goal for a lot of limited series. I know a lot of companies who their whole thing is they love making limited series. They're fun, but they're expensive. And the way that they justify these expenses is if we sell one of our limited series per year, or if we option, we don't even have to sell. Like, even if there is hope that one of our limited series throughout the year could potentially turn into something in the film and TV realm that justifies the rest of our spend, that allows us to spend on maybe more expensive hosts or advertising or whatever it is. So it's definitely a strategy that some production houses employ. It's not for every type of podcast, meaning, there are some chat shows that could lend themselves to film and TV, or the concepts within them can lend themselves to film and TV. But I would never venture to guess a percentage on this, but such a small percentage of the audio content being created is going to be thought of as interesting for film and TV. Most creators, the vast majority, are not going to be approached in any way to have their content be turned into intellectual property, or their intellectual property is not going to be turned into potentials for film and TV. So it's not a strategy that people should rely on. I think that it's been going on for a while. I mean, 2017, Dirty John came out. I think it was 2017 from Wondery. Wondery has been in this game for a while. They're based in LA, so they've got a lot of connections there. Novel in the UK has a lot of deals with film and TV. There's a lot of these prestige audio companies that have first look deals with TV and film companies. So there's a pipeline. I don't think it's a bad thing. I have a lot of pride when I see the credits on a screen that this was adapted from a podcast. That's the coolest thing in the world to me.
Yeah.
I am just such an advocate. Like when I see the word podcast in the wild, I'm like, got to share with James Cridlin so that he can share in Pod News in the podcast in the wild section, because it's such a joy to see. And I think that there's a community of people who rally around that. Does that answer your overall question?
It does. Thank you,
Okay.
Arielle. And you mentioned James Cridlin there, and I know Sam Sethi too, who's been a new evangelist of a new movement. And I don't really want to get into the whole RSS and audio versus video type conversations, and how Web 3.0 kind of plays a part in that, and payments and stuff. But the question that I wanted to come back to around it is just the pure top level audio and video, because what started off as predominantly an audio forum is becoming more and more video, whether that's YouTube podcasts, because Google Podcasts is going away again at the time of recording, whether it's Apple, they're up to something behind the scenes, they're adjusting the toolkit on the podcast behind the scenes, I think, at the time of recording again. But then Spotify have made a play, and various sort of guises. We're seeing more and more video content. We're seeing the studios being invested in, the fancy lighting rigs, the two people in the soft armchairs speaking to each other.
They love the clips for social.
Yeah, just wondering on your views on this, and do we all end up there? Because you can start very much with a smartphone, just talking into it. To some degree, you've got a podcast, and then you've got magic that, like Descript, where you can press a button, lose ums and ahs, and edit video with text, which is just, I mean, if you had said that to me 5-10 years ago, I'd have said that's impossible. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I tried to say Brill. I like, that's like one of my favorite Britishisms.
Okay, very good. I like that. But where are you at with this whole video podcast?
I was very against it a few years ago. I was very, podcasts are audio only. And I still believe that there is room for audio only podcasts. I listen to audio only podcasts only. When I listen to a podcast, I am doing other things. I am not looking to sit and have my phone or my computer out. I don't necessarily care for looking at the hosts or looking at an animation of a story. However, I also can recognize that a lot of people discover podcasts by way of social media, and it is much easier to share a video on social media than it is to share an audiogram. Videos are way more likely to go viral than audiograms are. The majority of new listeners are discovering the concept of podcasts by way of video, by way of TikTok or YouTube or whatever. There's a lot of research on this from Sounds Profitable. And because of that, I am not an RSS purist. I'm not like, oh, if it's RSS, it has to only be whatever. That's fine. A podcast is defined as how anybody who is listening to audio or watching video defines it. So if somebody says to me, I just discovered a new podcast, and I'm like, oh, where'd you listen? And they say YouTube, I'm not going to be like, that's actually not a podcast, because I'm not a freak. I'm not trying to negate somebody's experience. I think that if you think you listen to a podcast, you listen to a podcast. That is good for the overall podcast industry to have the word podcast in more people's mouths. So I am not a purist about this anymore. Do I think everybody is headed the way of video? I don't think that they need to be. I think that if you want to test out video, you should test out video. You should use Descript to make yourself audiograms or videograms. You should, if you're already recording video, take some of that video, make some clips out of it. They don't have to be long clips. They can be 10 seconds. They can be 30 seconds. They can be 2 minutes long. It doesn't have to be a full video version of your podcast. Test out some things. If it is working for you, even a little bit, do a little guessing and checking. Decide maybe your captions aren't the right color. Maybe your call to action at the end isn't the right color. Maybe your problem is actually in your content, which takes us back a little bit further. But there's a lot to consider when you are thinking about starting video, and then if you're thinking about continuing video. So if we had all the time in the world, I could go on for another 10 minutes, but that's my quick and dirty.
Well, I like that, Arielle, and thank you, because it is interesting for somebody that was maybe more of a purist. There is that sort of acknowledgement now, isn't there, that there is a bit of a change there. But also, interestingly, things like YouTube, although their podcasts are growing on YouTube, a lot of people are just passively listening to them. They're not actually watching anything, even though they're listening to it on YouTube. And you mentioned Sounds Profitable and people like Brian there, or whether it's Mark Asquith or James Bishop or Sam or Jay. It's great to get other people's views on where we think this is going, because there is still a very hardcore RSS audio only contingent in the podcast community.
Yeah,
I think.
definitely.
I'm not saying one thing's right and one thing's wrong. I'm just saying the landscape is changing, that's for sure, whether it's through artificial intelligence, whether it's through the power of what we can do with text to audio now. And who knows where we're going to end up in a 3 to 5 year timescale. But thank you for sharing it. I do appreciate it. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 quick questions. Number one is the next 6 to 12 months. I'm almost frightened to ask you this because you've got everything going on, and I'm sure there's lots on the horizon. But how do you go about planning? What's on your horizon for the next 6 to 12 months? What are you looking forward to over the next year or so?
I'm going to answer this from the software perspective, from the Descript perspective. With more video coming into play, I think we all need to get more comfortable captioning everything. We need to be making sure that we have baked in captions. Yes, a lot of platforms that we're posting our content on will automatically generate captions, but the beauty of Descript or Trint or Rev is that or Otter is that you can make sure those captions are correct, which means that you are making sure that you're representing yourself in the best light possible. So not only is it great so that you can represent yourself well, but it's great for accessibility. And you've generated this transcript. You can then take that transcript and make some things out of it. You can make blog posts out of it. You can use it for social posts. Lots of reasons that you should be captioning. I also just think, like, get used to, if you go to an event and audio is playing, there's not just a waveform. Let's also caption those audio representations on screen so that it's accessible to everybody. So that's going to be something that I'm really focused on.
Well, that's good, actually. And when you talked about the capturing the waveform as well, I think that's a great thing for people to focus on. But yeah, baked in captions versus auto-generated, maybe with some mistakes still at this point in the technological evolution. It is great to be able to own that space and to bake those in, for sure. Last question. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today, or maybe it's
so much.
Maybe it's something we
couldn't
have
get to everything
that you want to double down on. What do you want to leave us with?
I would like to leave you with the idea that you should try a podcast out today or this week that you don't think is right within your comfort zone. Go on your podcast player of choice. Listening app is what I was going to say. And allow your eye to drift to cover art that you would not normally choose on your own, and hit play on the trailer and see if it intrigues you. Even if it doesn't, that is okay. The point is, explore the wide world of content that is out there and report back. I would love to hear what people think about this experiment.
Yeah, I really like that. It's funny, when I did a little bit of design for a while, and one of the exercises was to go and purchase magazines on topics that you had no interest in personally, but just to immerse yourself in that different way of thinking and that different type of content and approach to design. I love that. Yes, it's always good to have a look and to see and to take on new things. Look, if people want to connect with you, Arielle, people want to find out more about the EarBuds Podcast Collective, more about Descript, more about the work that you're doing, where's the best place to point people to as we come to the end of our time here today?
ArielleNissenblatt.com is my website. It has all my contact information. I would say social, but you don't own social media forever and you never know how things are changing over there. So ArielleNissenblatt.com is a great place.
Well, that brings us nicely to the end of this episode of the Global Discussion. Thanks to everybody who's been watching or listening to this episode. Do all the usual things we need you to do to help support the show. Make sure you go out and check out everything that Arielle's doing. And I hope that you'll join me back here for some more discussions with creatives and leaders and thinkers just like Arielle. Thanks, Arielle. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.